A university emails a questionnaire to a random sample of 1,000 alumni, asking whether or not they would contribute to a fund drive for the construction of a new library. One of the questions posed is, would you consider donating a small amount of money in order to help the university build a state-of-the-art library? Research has shown that universities with modern libraries are ranked higher in U.S. News & World Report. They received responses from 253 alumni. Name 2 potential sources of bias. Once again, you have to know the 3 types of bias: selection bias, response bias, non-response bias. So in this case, we have response bias, questions. The question is asked in a leading way. So they emphasize that it's a small amount of money. They say it would build a state-of-the-art library. They also talk about how the library will improve the school's ranking. And to alumni, it's important that their school is thought of well. That's the school you're putting on your resume. So all this is sort of designed to get the alumni to answer yes. We also have non-response bias. And in this case, only 25% responded. You don't always know the number, how many responded. You can always assume that there's some level of non-response bias. Unless I specifically say that they had a really high response rate, again, you're going to assume there's some non-response bias. So some people just don't bother to respond. So it could be in this case that the alumni who responded were those who are much more interested. So they're more likely to support that library. A researcher is interested in measuring the attitude towards mandatory seatbelt laws in the state of Arizona. The researcher contacts 35 retirement communities in the state and arranges to have surveys distributed to all residents. List 2 types of specific bias you think will be a factor in this study and explain why. So in this case, you can still use non-response. Even though it doesn't tell us how many people responded, again, you can always assume there's some level of non-response. And then the other one would be selection bias, because they only asked older Arizona residents. Okay. Now, if they'd only been interested in what senior citizens in Arizona thought about the new seatbelt laws, then that would be fine that they only asked, because that would be their population. Senior citizens in Arizona. But in this case, they wanted, their population was all people living in Arizona, so you can't just ask older people. We would assume that their opinions would be different than younger people. Okay, so 2 specific types of bias. Again, you have to know them by name. Okay. A poll reported that 72% of teenage girls were fans of the Hunger Games trilogy. The poll was based on the response of 1,020 teenage girls. What is the margin of error for this poll? So my margin of error would be 1 over the square root of 1020. A poll reported that 72% of teenage girls were fans of the Hunger Games trilogy. The poll was based on the response of n equals 1,020 teenage girls. What is the margin of error for this poll? Round to the nearest hundredth and express as a percent. So in this case, our margin of error is 1 over the square root of n. So that would be 1 over the square root of 1020. And that is equal to 0.0313, okay? So if we first round to the nearest hundredth, that gives us 0.03, and then that's 3%, okay? All right. This is the one that students usually find a little more difficult. It says you want to conduct a poll with a 7% margin of error. What sample size do you need? So we're just going to use the same formula, but we need to do a little extra math. So we have 1 over the square root of n, and we know we want that to be 7%. And I'm going to write it as 0.07 over 1. Okay. Then we can look at it as just multiplying the cross products, and the reason that I'm doing that is because fractions are difficult. Okay, so I get 0.07 times the square root of n equals 1, 1 times 1, and 0.07 times the square root of n. I'm going to divide both sides by 0.07. The square root of n is equal to 14.29. Now to get the n by itself, I just square both sides, and n is equal to 204. There's definitely going to be a question like this on the test, so it really is something that you need to practice and practice and practice if you're really not confident in your algebra skills. Okay, so there are some multiple choice that I'm just going to mention. Okay, it says, what's the difference between a biased and an unbiased sample? A biased sample is one in which there isn't any type of random sampling. Okay, what is replication and how would you apply it? That is just going back to the question that I added with the rats. I said, what was the replication? I said it was 6. So I will give you a study and I will ask you, what is the replication? Not to explain what replication is, but to give me an actual number. And replication is the number of subjects in each treatment group. Okay? You have to be able to identify explanatory and response variables, and you have to know the difference between observational and experimental studies. Okay?